Okay, a my gotowy. Окей, тогда на английском начинаю. Ой. Okay. I am very glad to introduce our next expert, because today we have now had two sessions, two presentations with an in-depth inside view of the Norwegian system of petroleum revenue management. And our speaker here is Halstein Havåg. He is the head of science and projects at Bellona. Bellona is a major Norwegian environmental NGO, which Halstein will talk more about in a second. And I think his presentation will be of interest to a great many of you. It's called Civil Pressure for Good Governance, How Bellona Works for Transparency and Better Management of Natural Resources. So, among other things, we'll hear about how Norwegian civil society has attempted and worked for influencing this system we have heard a lot about today. So I'll give the word to Halstein. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to Nupi and to Christian for this invitation. As he said, my name is Halstein Havåg, and I'm head of science and projects in Bellona, which means I'm responsible for the 15 advisors that we have working on a wide range of topics. I'd like to start out this talk to tell you briefly about the story of Bellona. Today, the Bellona Foundation is one of the largest environmental organizations in Norway, and we also have a significant footprint abroad. We work with topics such as nuclear pollution, petroleum industry and fossil fuels, environmental toxins, waste and resource management, climate change, and the change toward a carbon negative future, sustainable aquaculture, the Arctic, and human rights issues. We want to instigate change, which means that we are on the arenas where we can make change happen. And då saknar den här. And we work with everyone, which means politicians, bureaucrats, business people, media, other non-profit organizations, NGOs, foundations, and research and education. Bellona is a think tank, it's a policymaker and a lobbyist, and it is a watchdog. And the tools we use to achieve results span the entire spectrum from dialogue to civil obedience. When Bellona was founded in 1986, a dynamic and efficient organization was the goal of the founders. A knowledge-based environmental police was used as a term in the media. And for many years, this was the modus operandi for much of the work we did. In the last half of the 80s, the environmental struggle in Norway looked quite different than it does today. Knowledge-based activism was the goal of this organization. Society needed to open its eyes to the problems we had. And for many years, the struggle was to get civil society, politicians, media, and industry itself aware and start caring about the environment. Climbing chimneys, digging out toxic waste from the ground, chaining oneself to factory doors, getting arrested, getting let out again. This was the way we mainly worked. As an example of how Bellona worked then and for many years, in 1987, workers at Hydro Porsgrunn here in Norway contacted Bellona and said they were poisoned by mercury. a highly toxic compound that was used in electrolysis to produce chlorine. The workers told that the industrial medical officer at the factory was fired after she'd been worried and protested the lack of measurements of mercury in the factory. Workers were seriously ill. They had trouble breathing, and still today, many of them suffer from late consequences of these days. Bellona started the work by studying the industrial giant Hydro, learning about the old factory where the problems occurred, and gaining significant knowledge about mercury emissions. Only after this was done, action was decided. Journalists were asked to be standing by the factory doors. And then people from Bellona stormed the factory with pickaxes and crowbars. But the purpose was to take measurements, to samples. A lot of samples were taken and were later sent to analysis. The Bellona actionists were arrested by the police, but were fairly quickly let out again. Then we went to the police ourselves and pressed charges. The case received massive media attention, and Hydro management, reluctantly, had to admit that there had been emission of several tons of mercury. The Bellona investigation showed that there were extreme and hazardous amounts of mercury at the factory. And in the end, it proved to be 167 tons. To put that in perspective, the annual emissions from all industry in Norway in total today is 1 ton. The factory was to be demolished, but when this was not done properly, Bellona pressed charges again. In the end, Hydro had to spend 500 million kroner, or about 60 billion euros at that day's rate, to fix the problems. Again, knowledge, action, using the media, gaining attention, pressing charges, and instigating change. Environmental awareness grew in the 80s, in part due to Bellona's capacity to raise the attention across the society. In 1993, we launched the first action against oil production in the Barents Sea. In 1994, we launched the first complete mapping of radioactive pollution in the Russian north. And the same year, we went to the Kola Peninsula with the European Commissioner for Environment. They were appalled with what they saw and promised involvement from the EU. In 1995, we launched the first suggestion on how Norway could cut CO2 emissions. And 2 years later, CO2 was part of the Norwegian Pollution Act. In 1998, we launched Bellona's business cooperation program, not without controversy in the environmental movement. But the point for our sake was that we wanted a pragmatic solution, and we believed dialogue with business itself would lead to real change. We also went more international. In 1994, we established offices in Brussels and in Murmansk. And in 1998, we established offices in St. Petersburg, where we today have about 20 people working. In the EU, we're chairing 2 technology platforms. We are a funding member of CCAC, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, an international organization which this December played a vital role as a change agent at the UN Heads of State Assembly in New York. So, that's a bit about us. Then to the Oil Fund, or NBIM, or the Government Pension Fund Global. This is, of course, the major reason why you're here. Norway is uniquely placed in the world, and to have a national pension fund created to benefit the entire nation is a privilege. It's a source of fiscal security that few other countries can match. With this as a backdrop, we would venture that the Norwegian case to use this as a template for governing in other places in the world might be a stretch. However, the key principles of how we work on these issues may be of relevance to you and how to manage natural resources and public values as a whole. The Oil Fund was established in 1990. I'm sure you got the story today in detail. It was established as a long-term financial instrument to manage Norway's revenues from oil and gas. 5,470 billion Norwegian kroner, 665 billion euros. And it's about 5 Norwegian national budgets. Bellona's main position on this is that we should govern the funds to the best of the current and future generations, which is exactly what everybody else says as well. But we all fill it with a bit different meaning. So I'll talk about how we've at least worked with the pension fund for the last decade, as an example. The ethical guidelines of the fund were established in 2004, and they were put into operation in 2005. In 2008, the Ministry of Finance issued a revision with a hearing, and the changes were put into law in 2009. One main point from our side is that a passive stance on climate and environmental change within the fund just makes the pension fund act as a preserving force for business as usual and actually a supporter of climate change. Alternatively, we could make the fund a driving force for positive change. In whichever way you look at it, it is a political tool. Bellona's vision that we put forward in 2008 was that by 2020, the fund's climate strategy should ensure that the fund only invests in companies that would be competitive in an emission-free society, which means that we would invest, for instance, in renewable energies. And if we were to invest in coal companies, only coal companies that used carbon capture and storage technology. To reach this goal, we said that a framework for evaluating sustainability of companies needed to be developed. A similar approach had already been developed for anti-child labor efforts. So we said we need to develop an expectation document. Investor expectation on climate change. This document would put a demand on all companies we invested in on open reporting on collective climate emissions. It would develop a framework for evaluating current and future risk and opportunity related to climate change. For instance, how the price of CO2 would impact this company's economy. It would also establish guidelines for development of emission reduction plans for these companies. Based on this framework, we said we needed to evaluate the entire portfolio of the oil fund. And based on our findings, we should use active ownership to move these companies in the right direction. In addition to this, we said that the fund should open up to relatively limited investments in new assets like venture capital or private equity in environmentally friendly technologies and companies. Like the rest of the portfolio, these needed to follow strict ethical guidelines. And the final idea we put forward then was to establish the Norwegian Clean Energy Development Company that would use parts of the pension fund, put those in a different fund that would invest in renewable energies in developing countries. The hearing input we sent in 2008 was comprehensive. In addition to this, we worked actively to set the agenda in public to discuss these issues. In August 2008, for instance, we arranged a climate conference during ONS in Stavanger in Norway, which at that stage was the third largest oil exhibition in the world, and a place that gathered both politicians and business. Among people we invited to this climate seminar were Louise Quam, a world-renowned investment banker, and she discussed green investments and the role that the oil fund could play as a driving force for new investment powerhouse developments in Norway. With this knowledge-based approach, we could enter into discussions with Parliament and Ministry. We had close dialogue with the finance minister at that time, Kristin Halvorsen, and made sure to have a high profile in the media and in discussions and seminars and the like. So in 2009, the new guidelines were put into place. The department itself, the Department of Finance, Ministry of Finance, stated that few other organizations could see more of their input and demands in the law than Bellona. An international investigation, we had full victory on 3 specific causes. And an international investigation on how climate change affects the portfolio of the oil fund. This was concluded in 2011. An introduction of environmental investment program for pioneering projects within climate-friendly solutions, around 20 billion Norwegian kroner at the time. And introduce expectation documents, as I described before, investors' expectations to climate change. We have followed this in the years after, with some victories and some setbacks. The following year, 2009, after the law was in place, we had an international environmental meeting in Lofoten in Norway. This was before the election in Norway in 2009. We invited Louise Quam again, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the finance minister, and the environmental minister of Norway. And we created a dialogue. And what we learned from this dialogue enabled us to continue the momentum through the election and set the agenda for our topics through the election. The continued work suffered with the new finance minister, though, which came in place in 2009. And a few of our previous victories were turned to loss. We had argued and got support for this active investment portfolio in green technologies. As I said, about 20 billion kroner at the time. This active portfolio has later been invested in non-green ventures and in real estate, for instance, in London and Abu Dhabi. It's better than unabated coal investments, but still, it's not green solutions. We also used our research and activism to remove companies from the portfolio of NBIM. After Bellona had argued for quite some years and documented, with years of research, the fund withdrew from Norilsk Nickel. Our communication went through the Independent Ethical Council. Will do. As I said, our communication went through the Ethical Council of NBIM. And we had worked with industry pollution in Norilsk since 1991. So it was a long case to argue. As later this spring, this year, the Strategic Council, which I'm sure you'll learn more about, of NBIM proposed to remove the Independent Ethical Council of the pension fund and place the responsibility of evaluating ethical investments within NBIM itself. You understand NBIM? It's just a different name for the oil fund. Bellona feared that this move would hurt openness and good governance within the ethical investments. So we allied with other NGOs, with opposition parties, and got extensive media on our view. The majority in the parliament decided to keep the independent council in May this year. In a few key areas, Bellona has had no success at all. We still do not see that the fund is anything close to investing in assets suited for a low carbon or no carbon economy in 2020. We also believe that 5% of the fund still should be invested directly in renewable energies and environmental technology. And government is still keen on pointing out the pension fund is not a political tool. They have still to understand that the oil fund itself drives politics, whether we like it or not. But again, the changes that Bellona have been able to exert in the direction of the fund's investment have come because we have been using participation in political processes, such as hearings. A knowledge-based argumentation has always been used. Creating arenas for premise providers, such as the ONS seminar I talked about. Putting international pressure on the process through organizations and benchmarking. And cooperation with other NGOs and civil society as a whole, like joint statements that I just described this spring. So we believe the key success factor of influence lies within knowledge, pragmatism, and visionary thinking. That was all I had on NBIM at the moment, but I'd like to close on a somewhat broader perspective. In Bellona's view, the question of how we manage the revenues from our oil production cannot be decoupled from how we manage the resources themselves. How do we manage and govern our oil and gas fields? Although the political discussion of the fund itself is pretty consensus-based, I mean, there's some minor differences, but most political parties mean more or less the same. The question on how and what we do with the remaining oil resources we have is much more differentiated. Bellona has a firm stand that we should scale down the activity in Norwegian oil and gas, not open up the environmentally fragile, pristine areas around Lofoten, the Barents Sea, and the Arctic. And the full cost and risk in terms of environmental impact should be imposed on the oil companies. Norway's petroleum sector is heavily regulated, one of the most regulated in the world. But still, it does not cover all the cost and risk. The government holding office now argues that we should empty the oil fields and produce as much gas for export as possible. This was also the de facto politics of the last government as well. Parts of the vulnerable areas in the north have been temporarily preserved. But the discussion will come up again in the next parliamentary election, if not before. So petroleum politics are power politics in Norway. 250,000 people get their jobs either directly or indirectly from the oil business. And in a population of 5 million, it's quite significant. The rise of Norway from a middle-income country in the 60s to one of the wealthiest countries in the world 30 years later is a question, more or less, a story of oil revenues and governance. Our pension fund is now the largest of its kind. Arguing reduced activity of Norwegian oil production is a tough sell. Even if we in Bellona got full endorsement of all the changes we'd like to the pension fund, we would still argue that a planned withdrawal from the oil age is needed. Increased activity in the most vulnerable areas could permanently damage our future in terms of renewable resources. In any case, it's important from this perspective. that much of the discussion on how to govern these resources is a discussion that revolves around risk and benefits. It's also a value-based question. But much of the discussion on these issues are really related to perception of risk, evaluation of risk, and risk management. How do we price environmental risk versus financial risk? This is the language everybody uses, and it's imperative and needed that we approach the same question with an understanding of risk, of facts and analysis, knowledge and pragmatism. I could mention a few examples of that, but I think I just mentioned one, at least, on how we, for instance, work these days when it comes to questions related to good governance and management of the natural resources in the North Sea or in the Barents Sea. The Mercury exploration well is an example. June this year, Statoil were given permit to start exploration drilling at the Hoop field, which is the most northerly offshore exploration field in the world. The well was called Mercury. There is access to filing complaints when these permits are given. And we did, on the grounds that they were lacking measures to protect the migratory fields of a seabird called guillemot, of which 80% of the stock in the entire Barents Sea nests at Bjørnøya, the closest island to the oil field. An oil spill could cause major irreparable damage to this population. We issued a complaint to the Norwegian Environmental Agency, which approved our complaint. They decided to strengthen the environmental regulations on Statoil. But we found them insufficient still. There was a 3-week period for lodging an appeal. When we filed the complaint 3 weeks later, we found that Statoil had completed the exploratory drilling and left the site. So we started looking into the background and asking data directly from the agency, which we got. We found that 160 permits were given. Of the 160 permissions to drill, of the 162 permissions to drill, 160 were given with effective date the same day, which basically means that you could easily ignore the deadline of complaints. In 11 of these cases, drilling was started up before the deadline as well. So Bellona went to the media and got national coverage with our claim that this practice was undemocratic. It did not have due process. The first reply from the agency said that the oil companies applied with such short notice before the desired startup that the agency felt compelled to effectuate the permit at once. Cost-efficient management was an important demand on the agency. This made the agency look weak, but it also put pressure on the oil companies themselves to change their practice. And they also stated that they would do that in the media. We sent a letter to the Ministry of Climate and Energy asking for a formal account. The ministry came back claiming that it was not illegal, which we hadn't stated. We had said it was undemocratic and lacked due process. In any case, Statoil admitted to improving their processes. They would improve. And meetings between the agency and Statoil were also set in motion. The environmental agency looked weak, at least at the time, but at least they had the support from the ministry that they operated within the law. As this is the case, it will be followed up by opposition in Parliament this fall to change this practice. For Bellona, we lost the standing, at least partly, with the Ministry of Environmental Affairs. They were furious on us that we had a seeming lack of legal competence. We were surprised that the Ministry of Environmental Affairs had decided their job was to support big oil and not to ensure due process in environmental cases. In any way, the contribution we did this last summer would hopefully change the practice as it is today, but it needs follow-up over the next 2 years. And this is just one example of many. But again, how we work to effectuate change in management of the natural resources, they revolve around applying pressure on government and parliament by ensuring that the public is informed, engaging civil society as a whole, and making arenas for discussion, either enter into coalitions with NGOs and so forth. The other way of applying pressure is to prove the government positively wrong through thorough research. Use the full extent of the judicial system to follow what we believe is right, and have an active approach to media in all forms. We also provide pressure on Norway through international work and influence. We have been working both in Norway and Brussels for many years. And in Brussels, we are part of the group that have been developing the offshore directive within the EU, which in some way or the other will become Norwegian law as well. And the offshore directive puts a much stricter risk analysis requirement on the oil companies. And in the end, still, civil obedience, which we've done several occasions for the last decade, like actively blocking seismological studies or exploratory drilling in some form or the other. So just to briefly round off, even if we see great societal benefits in governing the oil revenues like we've had with the oil fund, it is our primary job to ensure that sustainability is considered within all governance of resources and the revenues from those resources. Well, thank you, basically. Yeah, fine. Okay. Hope that gave you at least some idea of what we do. Now I open up to questions, if you have any. Let me just see if I can. Okay, let's try. First.
Альберт Каримов, Ямало-Ненецкий автономный округ, северный регион. Мы проводили у себя в Ямало-Ненецком автономном округе, наша общественная организация, Ямальский экологический форум, и имели сотрудничали с представителями организации БИОНа в России. Вот, было очень приятно. Вот, и хотелось бы узнать, в каких странах у вас есть еще представительства и направление деятельности вот в этих странах, немножко и в России в том числе, как вы занимаетесь. Ну, мы немного знакомы, но вот более шире было бы интересно.
Okay. Today we have offices or active offices in Norway, Russia, and in Brussels. In Russia, we have 2 sites, one in Murmansk and one in St. Petersburg. In Russia, we have ongoing 2, umbrella projects, so to say. And they revolve around, first, one project related to environmental issues and democracy. And the main purpose of that, and it's been basically the purpose of the St. Petersburg office since it opened in '98, has been to ensure proper information to the public at large, and also provide support, legal support, to other NGOs in Russia as well. So it revolves around that, and also investigations, of course. Bellona Russia issue quite a few papers a year with a wide range of topics. Another important part of the work is a project that we name Industrial Pollution in the Russian Northwest, which is much surrounding the industrial pollution from Norilsk Nickel and the surrounding areas. And fact-based learning of the consequences there, also enter into dialogue with civil society and Norilsk itself are key aspects to trying to instigate change. And we also have cooperation with Russian authorities on several similar projects. In Brussels, the other country where we have significant presence, it's all about EU, more or less. At least the bulk of the work we do there surrounds cooperation on the technology platforms that we are chairing in the EU, which are for CCS, carbon capture and storage, and the second one is on biofuels. And there is a third platform, technology platform now emerging on energy storage that we're also going to be a participant in. And the chairman role and the active role in these platforms basically are to put together authorities, the commission and so forth, but even more importantly, business and other NGOs to create roadmaps and solutions to, for the case of CEP, which is the Zero Emission Platform, to involve ourselves in solutions to actually have carbon capture and storage large-scale projects in the EU. We've also previously had activities in the US. We had an active office in Washington a few years. That is put on hold at the moment, but we still have international presence. For instance, in several organizations, like I mentioned, CCAC, Clean Climate and Air Coalition, which is an international organization with several countries and NGOs that play an active role towards the UN and to several countries as well. So that's basically the main part of the work we do. I'm not sure in which, but we'll we'll start on the back there and go like that. Okay. The short answer to that is no. We haven't. But I don't think actually, to my knowledge, that we can find anything remotely similar to the situation in Russia today, in how we've been operating in Norway before. Of course, there were different times when we had more of an active stance on civil obedience, for instance, disobedience. We occupied the environmental minister's office in the 80s, filling her desk with rotten fish to make a point that she didn't do enough for pollution around a specific industrial site in Norway. But as I said, since we could do that, there really weren't any great dangers to our security. So the question to me is no, and we are greatly concerned about the situation. Absolutely.
Евгений Малышев, город Пенза. Нам сегодня рассказывали про уникальный нефтяной фонд, в котором уже аккумулировано 850 миллиардов норвежских крон доходов, долларов, да? Долларов, извиняюсь. И эти деньги идут для будущих поколений. Вот мне интересно, есть ли в Норвегии противники, которые, ну, противники создания такого фонда, которые там говорят, что для чего надо добывать нефть, там, улучшать экологическую ситуацию. Если есть, то какие доводы они приводят? И как вы сами относитесь к этому проекту?
Well, there is a broad consensus that we realize we have a great revenue from oil production, and there is wide consensus that some form of management of those revenues in the form of an oil fund is a good idea. Very few argue that we shouldn't have any, or that we should do radical changes to the oil industry tomorrow. But as I briefly touched upon previously, it is Bellona's view, and many other people's view as well, that we should significantly scale down the oil activity we have today. And I would say the main two reasons for that, in our view at least, is that first, we do not consider the total risk of oil production as it is today. There are still oil spills, small albeit, but still oil spills on several sites in the North Sea. There is a significant emission of greenhouse gases. There are issues with security and pollution onshore as well. Just a few years ago, there was a great fire at an oil treatment facility in the west coast, which caused significant health problems to the population of the nearby town. And we've shown also through our own studies that an oil spill, even remotely close to the size that we've had in Deepwater Horizon, would devastate large parts of the Norwegian coastline. We did a study a few years back that we got the Ministry of, or the Institute of Meteorology in Norway, an official institution, to do the dispersion studies for us on a similar accident. And it showed that it would lay waste to the coastline from Lofoten all the way up even to North Cape. One of the most healthy fish stock areas in the world. So, as we say, we don't consider the risk enough. And that's our basic position. The other position we take is that we need to prepare for an age after oil. And right now, Norway is extremely oil dependent. More than 11% of our national budget are direct income from oil. And as I said, 250,000 people work in the oil industry. And we are pretty sure that if it's one thing that we know, is that the reduction in activity in oil will not come planned and controlled and taper down nicely. There will be a disruption, and we are not prepared for the economy after an oil economy. So we need to prepare for that and focus our efforts on that. But I think the main opposition to oil industry as it is today revolves around the issues of climate change and environmental impact as a whole. Was that an answer to your question? Okay. I'll try to be a bit quicker when I reply. Okay, yeah.
такого характера. Вы сказали, что помимо экологических аспектов Белуна ведет защиту прав человека. Я помню, когда в начале 2000-х годов Белуна участвовала в защите известного военного журналиста, эколога Григория Пасько, что ему помогло, я думаю, достаточно сильно. И я хотел узнать, какие сегодня правозащитные проекты персональные по защите экологов ведет Белуна.
There I have to thank you for your question. And the POSCO case and the Nikitin case as well were great successes to us in the end, but they also involved people who took a very high personal risk. And to my knowledge today, and I'm sorry that I am fully involved in all projects that Bellona Russia does today. To my knowledge, we don't have any particular support for individuals today, but we are, for instance, concerned, and we've done that in the past. There was, I don't remember his name now, but there was a journalist linked to reporting on issues surrounding the Sochi Olympics that received jail time. I'm not sure about his position today. But that's the kind of cases we follow up and try to apply pressure on over longer term. But when it comes to concrete cases, I'm not in a position to inform you, unfortunately.
Да, Ефремов Александр, Москва. У меня вопрос о влиянии Белуна в Российской Федерации, потому что, как вы сказали, у вас зондичная организация и структуры, которые в Российской Федерации, они незначительно оказывают влияние на экологическую ситуацию, потому что вот в регионах чиновники зачастую не реагируют на доклады представителей Белуна в России. Соответственно, вопрос, а может ли центральный офис повлиять как бы с их лоббистские возможности на региональных российских чиновников в решении ряда проблем, потому что огромное количество экологических проблем в регионах связанных, и зачастую чиновники пишут отписки. Если будут, например, в международные доклады Белуна включаться ситуация в России, мне кажется, это более эффективно будет, чем региональные представительства, которые делают огромное количество материалов об экологии в регионах.
Yes, we do, and to a wide extent, we're already doing it today. We have our Russian website, the international website, which both in Russian and English publish 150, 200 articles a year on a wide range of topics concerning Russia and environmental issues in Russia, as well as democracy issues. When it comes to our impact in the regional governance and also in the national governance, you're right, it's difficult to come in real dialogue and real contact with management, with the authorities in many cases. But that's part of the reason why we're there. We're building, as far as we can, structures for civil society, informing the public, and also where we can go into engagement with local authorities to actually be able to form the same kind of arenas we have now in Norway that we didn't have 30 years ago. So that's a very general answer to your question, but it's important for us to have the national view of issues in Russia in one hand, and also use the international participation that we have. And for instance, this November, we are having a Russian seminar in Brussels with parliament politicians, where we actually put focus on certain issues concerning Russian environmental NGOs and such. So we're trying to use both those angles, but supporting civil society and slowly building civil society in Russia are one of the main purposes of what we do.
Меня зовут Карина Светлана, Ярославль. Мой вопрос касается вашего экспертного мнения, оценки экологических последствий разработки вот в северных регионах нефтедобычи, что касается. Вы, наверное, тоже наверное, принимаете в этом участие. Каково ваше мнение, какие могут быть последствия?
And I have to ask a follow-up question. Are you talking about oil or development in general?
Нефтяное развитие Арктики.
Well, when it comes to questions related to oil developments as a whole, we don't have any double standards. We want to impose the same regulations and requirements on Russian side, on Canadian side, on Norwegian side, and Greenland, and so forth. And we are greatly concerned about the potential consequences of large-scale accidents in that area. And we do not feel that the risk, as I said, are actually taken care of. You have to remember when Deepwater Horizon happened in the Gulf, you heard about that, I guess, all of you, in 2010, was it? That was 780,000 cubic meters of oil, 4,000 boats, and over 55,000 people, volunteers, most of them, participated in almost perfect weather conditions in the Gulf to clean up the oil spill. They cleaned up 10% of the oil. The rest of it fell to the bottom of the Gulf or was washed ashore. Fisheries have gone down in many regions in the Mexican Gulf today with 40 to 70%. The business around long stretches of coastline are today only doctors and lawyers. It is an absolute catastrophe. And that was in perfect conditions. In the Arctic, with anything similar to that, I mean, the tugboat capacity on the Norwegian coastline are 5 boats. That's all. If you have a supertanker going ashore, there will be no way in winter conditions you can clean that up. And we need to consider those consequences. And I'll try to answer more quickly the remaining one. But there is another issue to point out as well. We believe that we are hiding behind the idea that oil and gas is going to be our future. The fact is that looking at oil fields on both Norwegian and Russian side, in the Arctic Ocean at least, most of them are never going to be developed. Not because of regulations, but because it's going to be too costly. The oil price of Norwegian oil today is around $90. It might be $100, but many of these fields need $115, $120 to even break even. So we need to develop a different dialogue on what other businesses we can build in that region to have a more sustainable society as a whole. And Bellona is writing a report these days, which is going to be published in May next year, which is looking at alternative business cases for the Arctic region, for development. And we're looking at particularly renewable energy, aquaculture and fisheries, and mineral extraction, and more environmentally friendly ways to do that. But there are several other areas of business as well that could be done as an alternative case to oil. Okay, I'll try to be fair. Who's 2 hands there, 1 there. So we'll start with you first, and then you, and then you.
Вадим Коростелев, скажите, пожалуйста, какой был бюджет Беллоны в прошлом году суммарно, и какой процент из этого бюджета вы потратили на исследование, получение новых знаний для гражданских?
Good question. The budget last year was, let's say, around 60 million Norwegian kroner. We employ about 65 people in Oslo, Russia, and in Brussels. We spend about, well, half of those people, more or less, in Norway, and a higher percentage of that in Russia work as advisors and work on actual cases. I don't have a number on how much of these 60 plus million that goes directly into research, but gaining knowledge in some way is, at least for the advisors that I work with, is more or less these days about 30% of the time, just as a guesswork. The rest of the time is used for lobbying, for media, for networking, and so forth. But it varies. And in periods we spend more time on research and development as well. Okay?
Наталья Назарова, Пенза. У меня 2 небольших вопроса. Первый. Структура финансирования вашей организации. И второй. Мне бы хотелось услышать опыт вот создания офисов в России. То есть это сами организации, какие-то общественные, экологические, российские, выходили к вам с инициативой создания этого офиса, или вы сами искали, и каким образом?
It's a good question, and I have to admit that my storytelling of how we started in Russia is a bit poor. So when it comes to the details there, I urge you to contact the Bellona Russia offices as well. But it's a slow build-up. We started out with people we knew in Russia, establishing simple offices there today. But that was in 94, 98. And doing the same today, I would guess, would be much more difficult, given the situation in Russia at the moment. Yes, we are contacted from other NGOs, and one of the many things we do, at least in the St. Petersburg office, is providing legal support and information to other NGOs and supporting the civil society, so to say, in that regard. I'm not sure I remember your last question. If you could repeat that, please.
Структура финансирования организации вашей.
Most of the funding we receive today is from cooperation with business and industry. I don't have the exact fraction in my head, but I would venture a bit like 2/3 of the financing we have maybe is from different types of cooperation with industry and commerce. The remaining funds come from a relatively large portion from various research funds, Norwegian and abroad, that fund concrete reports and research that we do over several years. That can come from research facilities and from Norwegian state money as well. And we also get some smaller amounts of money, for instance, from the Organization of Free Speech in Norway, arranging seminars and so. So that's more or less at least the main part of the funding we receive. Yeah.
Артем Горчинский, Москва. Во-первых, я хотел поблагодарить за вашу работу по предотвращению радиоактивного загрязнения в Мурманской области. Второй вопрос, ну скорее вопрос, почему вы такой акцент делаете на СО2? Ведь любой человек, когда он дышит, он производит СО2. Мы не можем построить систему, которая не производит СО2. И второе, ну и, соответственно, СО2 это является продуктом, ну, не продуктом, а ресурсом для роста лесов. То есть, как бы, не преувеличиваем ли мы влияние человека на природу?
To your last question, no. We are not exaggerating it. We are not talking about it in the size that the problem actually is. But it's a difficult thing to communicate because of at least two reasons that I can come up with. First, it is not visible and it's not immediate, the same way that toxic pollution and other types of pollution are. It's a slow growth. It's a complex story to tell. The second issue is that for many people around the world, they have more acute issues to deal with than CO2 emissions. And if you're actually let's say, for instance, living around a heavily polluted industrial site, you really don't care as much about CO2 as you do with dust emissions, fly ash, mercury, or other types of industrial pollution. But we've been concerned about nuclear pollution for many years. We did, as I said, the first tour of northwest Russia in '94, and were there even before that. But the question of CO2 and whether it's actually going to cause impact is not undercommunicated. It's not understood well enough by many enough people. And as I said, yes, we breathe it out. It's a resource for growing forests, but now, at this time, at least in history, we are emitting more CO2 than the forest can absorb. Very simply put. So we have the world has a carbon budget. We're about to reach that limit of 450 ppm in the atmosphere. So that's something of major concern to us. But it doesn't mean that we are not concerned about other sources of pollution. We work not only with climate change, we work with a wide variety of issues. And we have to remember those as well. We can't just focus on climate change. Yes?
Еще раз, Канислана, у меня вот родился еще второй вопрос. Он касается следующего. Есть ли у вас проекты по развитию альтернативных видов топлива и есть ли проект успешный в Норвегии, который реализуется? Альтернативные источники энергии.
Good question. Norway is in a were you asking about Bellona specifically or Norway as a whole?
Проекты Беллоны в Норвегии.
Well, we don't have any active projects in Norway at the moment concerning renewable energy. Norway is in a very special position. About 95% of the electricity we spend is renewable. So the important part for us when it comes to handling climate change is carbon capture and storage, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. And we could add a fourth one to that, and that's moving more of the fossil sources we have in Norway today over to electricity, because that would at least manage the issues with CO2 emissions more easily. So one example is that we have, for many years, since the end of the 1990s, worked with electric vehicles and argued towards the authorities that we need to have a phase-in of electric vehicles together with biofuels and other ones, but electric personal vehicles, to be able to handle the issue of reducing the carbon footprint. We imported electric cars in the late 90s, but a few years ago we actually got a law that provided big benefits to people, or not to people, but actually to buyers at least, of electric vehicles. So you get severe tax cuts on those cars. And that has led to the situation where Norway is one of the largest markets in the world for electric cars. We had 5 years ago, we had a few hundred cars in Norway. This summer we passed 32,000 cars. It's going to be more than 50,000 cars by April next year. And hopefully that is going to climb as well. But there are about 500,000 cars, 2 million vehicles of different sorts in Norway, so it's a long way ahead. But electrification of the society, together with biofuels, is, at least to us, important. But we also argue heavily for renewable resources as well, such as wind, for instance. Any other questions? Please, could you hold me? I lost the translation in my ear here. Maybe it's the batteries.
No, translation actually comes from
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, sure.
So how about that?
Yeah, should we try again? Okay. Yeah.
Суть вопроса в следующем. В деятельности своей организации, когда вы рассказывали про нее, вы рассказывали, в том числе и делали акцент на том, что те или иные вопросы, которые были злободневными с точки зрения вашей организации, доносились до жителей при помощи средств массовой информации. Средства массовой информации являются лояльными к вам, они с удовольствием выступают вашими союзниками для донесения, скажем, таких идеалов. В связи с чем у меня вопрос? Насколько у вас наложен контакт с средствами массовой информации, насколько это является для вас решающим фактором для донесения идей организации до граждан и жителей Норвегии? И используете ли вы какие-либо иные альтернативные средства коммуникации с общественностью? Какие-то, может быть, форматы тоже там субкультурные, может быть, общаетесь больше с молодежью, какие-то выступаете с какими-то лекциями, с детьми, начинаете сразу, собственно говоря, с молодых ногтей людей, жителей обучать охране окружающей среды.
Thank you for your question. First things first, we're very fortunate to have a relatively independent media in Norway. And because Bellona has been part of the public debate for 25 years or more, we have good contacts with several journalists that still would like to claim their independence, of course, but we have a good dialogue with journalists and several media houses as well. That doesn't always mean that we are able to get the topics we'd like to discuss in the international media presence. But we have been quite clever over the years to know how to pitch a case, to actually make it interesting for the media houses as well, and get into the public debate in that sense. But it is an important tool for us. It also has its drawbacks when we do mistakes. We're not talked easy to, but it is an important platform for opinion making in Norway, and it is important to us. And this has been years in the making, but I think it's the knowledge of which media house is most effective in which cases. Is it the business ones, or is it the tabloids? Is it the technical newspapers? And also always thinking clearly on how to pitch, how to angle a case to make it interesting. And in some cases maybe sacrifice a bit of detail to get your political views out there and start the debate at least. That's an important tool and something we're quite good at. But it's not the only platform. We are using, we're maybe not the best, but we are striving to be better at also using other platform of social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. We have these communication channels that we're using. We have our own websites, and more importantly in Europe, and at least not in Russia, our own website is a very powerful tool for communication because it's under our control and we can publish whatever we like. So that's an important arena for us to be at. And finally, if we have other platforms of communication to the public at large, from time to time, we'd like to be more active when it comes to engaging the younger population, because at least I think it's quite clear, although I don't have the numbers, but it is definitely clear that young people today are less concerned about and less conscious about environmental issues than I was when I grew up. So the opinion has changed. It's a more complex world, maybe, I don't know. I might sound old saying that, but at least we need to re-engage the younger part of the population. And one of the ways we do that is to develop communication instruments for use in school to actually point out important environmental issues that we have. And we are developing one tool like that now this fall that's going to be used next year. So we need to be on those arenas to get the kids back and more engaged in environment in general. Okay?
Ну, это общее уточнение хотелось бы. Вот вы сказали, что 2/3 от 60 миллионов крон, а вы получаете от бизнеса, да, получается? Вот это как благотворительная деятельность или как какие-то услуги, которые вы оказываете? Это вот именно больше интересный вопрос практически точки зрения, потому что у нас различные организации, которые занимаются экологией в том числе.
Several different ways that we are engaging the business community. It's either through passive support, like actually buying PR space on our own websites and things like that. But we also have an extensive business cooperation program that we are entering into cooperation agreements with several businesses. But it's important to remember in that case that we are not, what's the correct English term for it? we are not a lobby organization for the others, and we are not just straight report writing business for others as well. We have our own ideas and our own programs that we are pitching to business and to business organizations and to industry organizations and so forth, interest organizations from the power business or industry. And if they are on with the idea, if they actually can see that we'd like Bellona to develop this further, then that is a basis for some way of cooperation agreement. But we are not entering into specific deals on developing a business, a business environmental program or putting businesses in direct contact with politicians and so forth. That's other NGOs' way of making money, not us. Okay, we are closing to half, so I think you're happy? Okay, thank you.